You don't understand how things work here. Pay up or lose your house. That's what the HOA president sneered yesterday, waving a foreclosure notice in my face. Not a warning, full foreclosure. Over a $47 trash can fine, $47. They'd already placed a lien and scheduled my home for public auction next week. I got home at 1 a.m., exhausted from a month-long work trip. Legal papers littered my kitchen counter. To my neighbors, I'm just the quiet retiree who keeps to himself. The perfect target for this power-hungry president. But sitting right beside her foreclosure packet is something she overlooked. My work credentials, and the records proving every step they took was blatantly illegal. She has no idea what I really do for a living. She messed with the wrong house, and the absolute wrong person. What would you do if an HOA tried to steal your home over pocket change? Drop your worst HOA nightmare in the comments, and tell me what state you're watching from. I read them all. Let me back up and show you how a federal judge ended up staring at foreclosure papers over a bird feeder. I'm Thaddeus Blackstone. 15 years on the federal appellate bench, handling everything from terrorism cases to constitutional law. But 18 months ago, Elena lost her battle with cancer. The silence in our DC townhouse became unbearable. Every corner held memories that cut like glass. So I did what any grieving widower would do. I bought a modest house in Willowbrook Estates, told my neighbors I was a retired government worker, and tried to disappear into suburban anonymity. Elena always loved cardinals. During her chemo sessions, she'd watch them for hours through our bedroom window. "Their wings remind me that beauty survives everything," she'd whisper. So the first thing I did in my new home was hang her favorite bird feeder in the backyard. That's when I met Brinley Ashworth. Picture a woman who drives a white Escalade with blessed vanity plates and treats HOA violations like personal vendettas. At 48, she'd been our self-appointed neighborhood dictator for 6 years, unopposed, because who wants that headache? "Sir, that's an unauthorized exterior modification, $25 fine." The smell of her expensive perfume couldn't mask the stench of petty power. I paid it, figuring it was the cost of peace. Big mistake. Next came my mailbox, apparently 2.3 inches outside her imaginary compliance zone. $50. She actually brought a measuring tape and photographed her manicured nails holding it. The crunch of gravel under her designer heels became the soundtrack of my harassment. Then came the trash can incident that sealed my fate. I left for Denver to preside over a month-long federal terrorism case. While I was protecting national security, Brinley was building her case against my garbage bin. $47 for extended visibility violation. My trash can stayed out 12 minutes past pickup. But here's where Brinley revealed her true genius. While I was gone, she fast-tracked all 3 violations through some legal loophole that turned $122 in fines into a full property lien. HOAs can place liens for unpaid fines, but most states require 90 days notice and proper hearings. Emergency procedures often skip these protections during owner absences. Always designate someone to monitor HOA correspondence during extended travel. When I got home Monday night, my house had already been seized. Lien filed, foreclosure scheduled, auction set for next week. While I was deciding cases that reshape constitutional law, Brinley had been rewriting property law in her favor. I started investigating and found her pattern. Chuck Brennan next door lost $3,000 to emergency deck repairs by her brother-in-law's company, Mrs. Brianna was forced to destroy her vegetable garden for violations. Frank Wilson lost his entire house to mysterious assessment fees. 23 families had been hit with liens in 2 years. Single men, recent widows, elderly residents, anyone who looked vulnerable became Brinley's prey. But Tuesday morning, she made her fatal mistake. I was checking mail when that ridiculous Escalade pulled up. She rolled down her window with a victory smirk that could curdle milk. "Having trouble keeping up with your obligations, Mr. Blackstone?" She waved my foreclosure notice like a trophy. "Maybe homeownership is too much responsibility for someone like you." Someone like me. My coffee turned bitter. She had no idea who she was talking to. No clue that her quiet retiree victim had spent 15 years making federal law. Standing there watching her drive away to terrorize another neighbor, Elena's voice echoed in my memory. Sometimes the most important battles happen in the smallest places. This wasn't about my bird feeder anymore. This was about a systematic predator who'd been stealing homes while I was busy with important federal cases. Well, Brinley wanted to see what someone like me could do when properly motivated. Time to show her exactly what 15 years of judicial experience looked like when turned against a small-time tyrant. The auction was 6 days away. Time to prove that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected courtrooms. Day 2. Time to find out exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. I woke up at 5 a.m. with the taste of yesterday's anger still bitter in my mouth. The smell of fresh coffee couldn't wash it away. While most people were dreaming, I was doing what federal judges do best: building a case. First stop, the county clerk's office. After 15 years on the bench, I knew exactly where predators hide their tracks, in plain sight, buried under legal jargon that most people won't challenge. What I found made my blood pressure spike higher than my caffeine level. Brinley hadn't just fast-tracked my case, she'd invented her own legal system entirely. Normal HOA procedure involves violation notice, 30-day cure period, board hearing, then formal lien filing. Every state requires these protections. I'd seen enough federal appeals to know. Brinley's express lane? Straight from violation to lien, skipping every homeowner safeguard like they didn't exist. Her excuse? Emergency enforcement authority during my absence. Apparently my bird feeder posed such an immediate threat to community standards that constitutional due process became optional. Then came the moment that changed everything. While the clerk printed my documents, her young assistant leaned over, clearly someone who'd seen this movie before. "Sir, you're the 4th one this month," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "Same violations, same emergency procedures. Always happens when homeowners travel." My judicial instincts kicked into overdrive. Brinley wasn't just targeting vulnerable people. She was timing her attacks like a military operation. I filed an emergency stay that afternoon, using every procedural trick 15 years of federal practice had taught me. Constitutional due process violations, discriminatory enforcement patterns, procedural irregularities buried in citations that would make Supreme Court clerks weep. Not identifying myself as a federal judge, just a very well-informed citizen exercising his rights. But filing paperwork was just foreplay. Time for real investigation. That evening, I walked through Willowbrook Estates as golden sunset painted the neighborhood. Beauty couldn't hide the ugly truth emerging with each block. Foreclosed properties with overgrown lawns, for sale signs gathering dust, elderly neighbors who'd suddenly stopped making eye contact. Chuck Brennan was watering his flowers when I approached. 60-something retired plumber with hands that spoke of honest work and calloused integrity. "Heard you got the Brinley special," he said without looking up. Water hitting petunias filled the silence. "How'd you know?" "Same look we all had, like someone gut-punched you with a legal document." He turned off his hose, finally meeting my eyes. "Want to know how deep this really goes?" Chuck's story made my prosecutor instincts scream. 3 years ago, Brinley cited his deck for structural non-compliance, demanding immediate repairs by her brother-in-law's company. $3,000 for work any handyman could have done for $500. "Here's the beautiful part," Chuck continued, voice dripping sarcasm. "Those violation photos, taken from inside my backyard." She trespassed to build her case. I remembered reading about similar cases during my federal tenure. HOA board members thinking authority meant unlimited access. Most states require 24-hour written notice for property inspections, and unauthorized entry to gather evidence violates both trespass laws and due process. Any case built on illegal evidence should crumble faster than Brinley's credibility. How many others? More than you'd think. Mrs. Brianna lost her vegetable garden to manufactured violations. Frank Wilson, they hit him for $5,000 in special assessments right after his wife died. Henderson family down the block got forced to repaint their house 3 times because colors were suddenly non-compliant. The pattern crystallized with terrifying clarity. This wasn't HOA abuse. It was organized financial predation dressed in legal costume. Brinley had created a family business model. Her brother-in-law grabbed repair contracts. Her real estate friend handled distressed sales. Her attorney fast-tracked liens with suspicious efficiency. But the smoking gun was hiding in the timing. Every emergency enforcement happened during homeowner absences. Business trips, family emergencies, medical procedures. She'd been stalking calendars and striking when victims couldn't defend themselves. That night, I spread documents across my dining room table like evidence in a federal case. The paper trail told a story any prosecutor would love. Systematic targeting, procedural violations, financial conflicts of interest. The irony was perfect. My Denver trip wasn't random vacation. It was documented federal business with official itineraries, security coordination, court records. Any decent prosecutor could follow that trail straight to Brinley's doorstep. Sitting there at midnight, surrounded by evidence of suburban corruption, I felt Elena's presence. She'd always said the law existed to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Time to remind Brinley that some tools cut much deeper than HOA bylaws. Tomorrow, I'd start building a coalition. In a neighborhood full of victims, finding angry allies shouldn't prove difficult. But tonight, staring at Brinley's handiwork spread across my table, one thing became crystal clear. She'd picked the wrong house to target, and definitely the wrong federal judge to underestimate. This was about to become very educational for everyone involved. Day 3. Time to turn victims into an army. The morning air smelled like rain and revolution. I'd spent the night connecting dots between Brinley's victims, and now it was time to connect the people themselves. 15 years of federal cases had taught me that justice isn't a solo sport. It requires teammates who refuse to stay silent. Mrs. Brianna was watering her flowers when I approached, but her garden looked nothing like the lush paradise Chuck had described. Where vegetables once grew, there was only bare soil and the ghost of community spirit. "Mr. Blackstone," she said without looking up, "I wondered when you'd come by. You heard about my situation? Honey, Brinley drove past your house 3 times yesterday with her windows down, celebrating like she'd won the lottery." Mrs. Brianna's laugh held bitter wisdom. She always celebrates too early. Inside her kitchen, the smell of jasmine tea couldn't mask the sadness in her voice as she told her story. 20 years of growing tomatoes and herbs for elderly neighbors who couldn't shop easily. Then Brinley arrived with her clipboard and manufactured violations. $50 became $200 with penalties, then $500 when I couldn't pay fast enough. Her hands shook slightly. Fixed income means choosing between medicine and fighting HOA fines. The garden lost, but Mrs. Brianna had been doing something Brinley never expected from a harmless old lady. "I documented everything," she said, leading me to her dining room. The table was covered with manila folders, each labeled with a neighbor's name. 43 families in 2 years, every violation, every photo, every payment demand. My prosecutor instincts started humming. This wasn't random harassment, this was systematic financial predation with a paper trail. Why keep all this? Because I knew someone would eventually have the tools to stop her. Mrs. Brianna studied my face with uncomfortable intensity. "Question is, are you that someone, Mr. Blackstone?" Before I could answer, Chuck appeared at her back door with a woman I hadn't met. Jessica Martinez, mid-30s, carrying the exhausted determination of a working mother pushed beyond her limit. "Figured you'd end up here," Chuck said. "Meet our resistance cell." Jessica's story added another ugly piece to Brinley's pattern. Single mother, 2 jobs, rarely home when violations mysteriously appeared. "She cited my kids' bicycles for being visible from the street," Jessica said, voice tight with controlled rage, "called them detrimental to community aesthetics. $200 fine plus mandatory storage shed from her brother-in-law's company." That's when the mini twist hit us like a freight train. Chuck was showing me Jessica's violation photos when the unmistakable rumble of Brinley's Escalade pulled up outside. Through Mrs. Brianna's window, we watched her park across the street, engine running, phone pressed to her ear, camera visible on her dashboard. "She's been doing surveillance runs since yesterday," Jessica whispered. "Following anyone who visits you, building files." My blood went cold. This wasn't just financial abuse. This was psychological warfare designed to isolate victims and prevent organized resistance. But Brinley had just made a tactical error that would have gotten her laughed out of federal court. "She's creating evidence of intimidation and retaliation," I said, judicial training kicking into high gear. "Every photo she takes of us meeting becomes prosecutable harassment." My counter-move came straight from federal investigation playbooks. Turn her surveillance into our advantage. "Mrs. Brianna, do you have a back entrance?" "Good. Chuck, call 5 neighbors from different directions. Tell them to arrive separately over the next hour, borrowing tools, checking on Mrs. Brianna, whatever looks natural." While Chuck made calls, I explained the strategy. Instead of hiding our coalition, We'd forced Brinley to work overtime documenting it, while we documented her documenting us. Over 2 hours, our accidental gathering grew. Frank Wilson, who lost his house to mystery assessments. The Henderson family, victims of the paint scheme scam. Maria Santos, hit with pool violations that defied physics. Each person brought documentation that would make any prosecutor weep with joy. Then Jessica dropped the nuclear option. I've been recording her surveillance drives and posting them on neighborhood Facebook with timestamps, she said quietly. Turns out she's been stalking families for months before violations appear. Frank leaned forward, weathered hands trembling with more than age. She served violation papers 6 days after my wife's funeral, said my grief was affecting property maintenance standards. The room went silent. Even after 15 years of federal courtrooms, that level of calculated cruelty made my chest tighten with rage. Time to show Brinley what organized neighbors can accomplish, I said, looking at 8 faces that had transformed from isolated victims into a determined coalition. Mrs. Brianna smiled for the first time since I'd met her. Mr. Blackstone, I don't know what you really did in government, but you certainly understand how to wage proper war. If only she knew. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would make Brinley regret every predatory choice she'd made. But tonight, watching our neighbors plan coordinated resistance while her Escalade sat outside taking photos, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Elena died. Purpose, and the sweet anticipation of justice about to be served. Day 4. Time to show Brinley what happens when you poke a sleeping federal judge. I woke to her Escalade idling outside my house at 6:30 a.m., exhaust fumes mixing with the morning mist. Through my window, I watched her photograph my front door, probably documenting that my newspaper was still visible past some imaginary deadline. What she couldn't photograph was the federal criminal complaint I'd been drafting since 3 a.m. The smell of Chuck's bacon drifted across our driveways as I stepped outside to retrieve my paper. Brinley rolled down her window with that predatory grin that belonged in a federal booking photo. Early morning, Mr. Blackstone. Hope you're not planning any more neighborhood disruptions. Just exercising my constitutional rights, I replied, making sure she caught the emphasis. Beautiful day for documentation, don't you think? Her camera hand trembled slightly, smart enough to sense danger, too arrogant to retreat. By 9 a.m., our coalition was operating like a federal task force. Jessica's group chat buzzed with real-time updates. Mrs. Brianna coordinated evidence collection with surgical precision. Frank reached out to victims in neighboring developments. Then Chuck brought news that made my prosecutor instincts sing. My nephew at City Planning just called, he said, practically vibrating with excitement. Brinley's HOA hasn't filed required financial disclosures in 3 years. State law voids all enforcement during non-compliance periods, including foreclosures. But Brinley's next move proved she was more vicious than I'd calculated. Around noon, my phone exploded with panicked texts from Jessica. "She's at my job, talking to my supervisor." I called immediately. Jessica's voice shook with barely controlled rage. She told my boss I was leading neighborhood disruptions and asked if they knew about my association with problematic residents. My supervisor looked confused, but the seeds planted. The mini twist hit like a legal sledgehammer. Brinley had escalated from property harassment to economic warfare, trying to destroy Jessica's livelihood for organizing resistance. That crossed federal lines I'd spent 15 years learning to protect. My countermove required the precision of a surgical strike. Emergency meeting tonight, I told our network, but this time we're going public. Instead of hiding in living rooms, we'd meet at the community center, public space, protected assembly, completely legal. Let Brinley document every single neighbor who'd had enough of her reign of terror. Every photo she takes becomes evidence of First Amendment retaliation, I explained to Jessica. Workplace intimidation for protected political activity, that's federal civil rights territory. But I had something bigger planned, something that would detonate Brinley's entire operation. That afternoon, I made calls to former federal colleagues who specialized in financial crimes and organized fraud. Hypothetical questions about HOA abuse patterns, elder targeting, mail fraud implications. Sounds like RICO territory, my former clerk at Justice said. Systematic targeting through fraudulent procedures, wire fraud if electronic payments involved, civil rights violations for demographic discrimination. Just academic curiosity, I replied. Sure, Judge. Hypothetically speaking, cases like that make prosecutors very happy. Evening came with the electric tension of approaching storms. Our community center meeting drew 42 neighbors, the largest gathering in Willowbrook history. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as victim after victim shared stories that painted a federal case any prosecutor would love. Brinley's Escalade sat in the parking lot like a predator watching prey, her camera working overtime to document our conspiracy. What she couldn't document was the briefcase at my feet containing federal complaint forms, constitutional violation templates, and direct phone numbers for prosecutors who'd been waiting years for a case this clean. Then came the moment that would flip everything. Maria Santos was describing Brinley's latest pool violation nonsense when the community center doors burst open. Brinley herself strode in, flanked by two men in cheap suits who looked like they'd been hired from a strip mall security company. "This unauthorized assembly violates community standards," she announced, voice echoing off the walls. "I'm documenting every participant for violation proceedings." The room went dead silent. 42 neighbors stared at this suburban dictator who'd just walked into what amounted to a federal investigation planning session. That's when I stood up. "Mrs. Ashworth," I said, letting my courtroom voice fill every corner of the room, "you just made a very interesting legal choice." Her camera stopped clicking. Those expensive heels suddenly didn't sound so confident on the linoleum floor. Intimidating residents engaged in protected First Amendment assembly is a federal civil rights violation. Retaliation against workplace reporting constitutes conspiracy, and threatening 42 citizens simultaneously? I smiled the way I used to smile at defendants who'd just incriminated themselves on the record. "Well, that's what prosecutors call a pattern of racketeering activity." Brinley's face went white as community center tiles. Tomorrow she'd discover exactly what kind of retired government worker she'd been harassing. But tonight, watching her flee with her rent-a-cops while 42 neighbors cheered, I felt Elena's spirit in the room. Justice was coming to Willowbrook Estates. Day 5. The day Brinley's house of cards started collapsing in spectacular fashion. The morning coffee tasted like victory as evidence flooded my kitchen like a federal raid. After Brinley's community center meltdown, neighbors who'd been terrorized into silence for years suddenly found their voices and their documentation. Frank Wilson arrived at 7 a.m. carrying a banker's box that would change everything. "Found these in my wife's papers," he said, voice thick with emotion. "She kept every piece of paper Brinley ever sent us. Said someday someone would need proof." What spilled across my kitchen table made my federal prosecutor instincts scream with excitement. 4 years of financial records, revealing the true scope of Brinley's criminal enterprise. This wasn't just HOA harassment. This was systematic embezzlement disguised as community management. The HOA operating account should have contained $127,000 in resident fees and assessments. Actual balance? $34,000 and hemorrhaging fast. Brinley had been bleeding our community dry through shell companies that existed only on paper. Her brother-in-law's emergency repair company had billed $89,000 in 18 months. For a development where most residents did their own maintenance, those numbers were criminally impossible. Then I found her masterstroke, a legal consulting firm that turned out to be Brinley, paying herself $2,500 monthly for specialized enforcement services. She'd been billing the community to harass the community, but the nuclear option was hiding in Mrs. Brianna's mail. Around 9 a.m., she knocked with documents that made my judicial blood run cold. "Misdirected insurance correspondence," she said quietly. "Previous residents forwarded mail. Insurance claims for community damage that was never repaired. Pool equipment failure, $15,000 claimed. 0 spent on actual fixes. Clubhouse roof damage, $22,000 in insurance money, while residents still used buckets to catch rainwater during meetings. The smell of fraud was so thick it practically choked my kitchen air. I'd prosecuted enough financial crimes to recognize this pattern. Organized theft using legal procedures as camouflage. Mail fraud, wire fraud, insurance fraud, elder abuse, civil rights violations for systematic demographic targeting. Brinley thought meticulous documentation made her untouchable. Instead, she'd been building a federal case against herself for years. Every violation notice mailed through postal service, mail fraud jurisdiction, every electronic payment demand, wire fraud territory, every elderly resident targeted, federal elder abuse statutes. By noon, I had enough evidence to bury her for a decade, but something even better was about to unfold. My phone exploded with Jessica's panicked voice. Turn on Channel 7 News now. I grabbed the remote and my coffee cup nearly slipped from my hands. Breaking news banner. Federal investigation launched into suburban HOA fraud ring. The reporter was standing outside Willowbrook Estates, interviewing neighbors I recognized from our coalition meetings. Sources confirm the FBI has opened a formal investigation into systematic financial crimes targeting elderly residents through fraudulent homeowner association procedures. My phone rang immediately. Unknown number. Judge Blackstone? The voice was crisp, professional. This is Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We understand you might have information relevant to our investigation into Willowbrook Estates' HOA activities. The room went silent, except for my heartbeat thundering in my ears. How did you... Sir, your former colleagues at Justice speak very highly of your investigative instincts. They suggested you might be uniquely positioned to assist our inquiry. Through my window, I could see news vans arriving, FBI vehicles with tinted windows, and Brinley's Escalade sitting motionless in her driveway like a white elephant about to be seized as evidence. Agent Martinez, I said, feeling Elena's spirit fill the room with satisfaction. I think you're going to find this case very interesting. Tomorrow's foreclosure auction was about to become the least of Brinley's problems. The federal government had finally arrived at Willowbrook Estates, and they brought handcuffs, day 6. The calm before Brinley's very public hurricane. My living room looked like a federal war room at 6 a.m. Agent Martinez sat surrounded by evidence boxes while her team set up surveillance equipment that would make NASA jealous. Judge Blackstone, she said, studying financial documents with the appreciation of a prosecutor who'd found Christmas morning. This RICO case is so clean it practically prosecutes itself. Systematic targeting, organized fraud, elder abuse. She documented everything. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the electricity of a perfectly orchestrated federal takedown. But I had something more satisfying than standard prosecution in mind. Agent Martinez, what's your arrest timeline? We could take her this morning. Wire fraud alone means 20 years federal time. I propose something better. Tomorrow's auction happens at 2 p.m., community center, full media coverage. Brinley plans to personally oversee what she thinks will be my public humiliation. Agent Martinez's eyes lit up with prosecutorial poetry. Public arrest in front of all her victims? Every HOA tyrant in America needs to see what happens when you systematically abuse vulnerable people. I pulled out my phone, showing her the media coordination Jessica had arranged. Channel 7 is broadcasting live, 3 newspapers sending photographers, social media campaigns already viral. The next hours moved like a precision federal operation. State investigators prepared civil asset forfeiture to freeze HOA accounts and recover $127,000 in stolen funds. The Attorney General coordinated with federal prosecutors for maximum charges. But watching our neighborhood transform from isolated victims into an organized community demanding justice, that was the real victory. Chuck arrived with a pickup loaded with folding chairs, the metallic clanking echoing through the morning air. Mrs. Brianna's making cookies for media folks, says reporters work better when properly fed. Jessica had become our unofficial press coordinator, scheduling victim interviews while maintaining operational security. Channel 7 wants live coverage. They're calling it Federal Justice Comes to Suburbia. Then Frank Wilson brought news that made my judicial heart sing. My daughter's Chicago Tribune picked up the story. They're sending photographers tomorrow. Editor says if this goes viral, it could spark nationwide HOA reform legislation. The domino effect was beautiful. One federal investigation becoming a movement that could protect vulnerable homeowners nationwide. But around 3 p.m., Brinley made her final desperate move. A process server appeared with emergency court papers that made Agent Martinez burst into laughter. Brinley was seeking an injunction to stop the auction, claiming intimidation by organized criminal elements. She was accusing us of exactly what she'd been doing for years. She just filed provably false statements about an ongoing FBI investigation, Agent Martinez said, practically grinning. That's additional perjury and obstruction charges. Even better, she'd filed in state court while referencing federal crimes and investigations. Any competent judge would transfer to federal jurisdiction immediately, adding forum shopping violations to her growing list of felonies. Brinley had just handed prosecutors another conviction while trying to escape consequences of her previous crimes. I remembered a key principle from my federal tenure. Criminals often defeat themselves through escalating desperation. The trick is creating conditions where their panic leads to additional self-incriminating behavior. Evening brought our community center buzzing with more energy than it had seen in years. Neighbors arranged cameras, coordinated seating, prepared victim testimony for media interviews. Mrs. Brianna organized a potluck dinner that filled the air with home-cooked aromas and something more valuable, the sound of neighbors laughing together, sharing stories, preparing to witness justice served communally. "Mr. Blackstone," she said quietly while we stacked chairs, "I suspect tomorrow we'll all learn exactly what kind of government work you really did." Agent Martinez approached with final coordination details. Federal marshals positioned around the building, state investigators handling asset seizure. Media has designated coverage areas for optimal documentation. And our target? Completely oblivious. Surveillance shows she's still preparing auction paperwork, coordinating with auctioneers, planning what she thinks will be your public humiliation. Perfect operational security. The best federal takedowns succeed through superior preparation combined with complete tactical surprise. I spent evening on my back porch, watching Elena's bird feeder where cardinals flitted between branches, red wings catching sunset light. The same feeder that started this battle would witness its conclusion. "Tomorrow, sweetheart," I said to the cooling air, 43 families get justice. And every petty tyrant in America learns that some government retirees never stop protecting people. Agent Martinez's voice carried from inside where she coordinated final details with her team. All units in position by 1 p.m., media briefing at 1:30, target acquisition at auction commencement. The foreclosure auction was 18 hours away, but instead of losing my house, Brinley was about to lose her freedom, her stolen assets, and her ability to terrorize any more vulnerable neighbors. Sometimes the most satisfying retirement activities involve teaching criminals that federal justice follows you everywhere, even to suburban community centers. Day 6 evening. The night Brinley Ashworth lost her mind completely. Her Escalade came screaming down our street at 9 p.m. like a white missile, gravel exploding behind her tires. The screech of brakes outside my house sounded like a wounded animal, which wasn't far from the truth. Agent Martinez, coordinating final arrest details from my kitchen, moved to the window with predatory interest. "Subjects under investigation often self-destruct in the final phase," she observed. "She's about to gift us additional charges." Through the glass, I watched Brinley sit motionless for 10 minutes, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing wildly at shadows only she could see. Even 50 yards away, the desperation radiating from her vehicle was almost tangible. Then she exploded out of the Escalade and started pounding on my door like she was trying to beat it down. "Blackstone, open up! We're ending this tonight!" Agent Martinez grinned the way federal agents grin when suspects volunteer evidence. "Mind if we record this?" "Please do." I opened the door to find Brinley transformed into something from a suburban nightmare. Perfect blonde hair matted with sweat, expensive makeup streaked down her cheeks, designer outfit wrinkled like she'd been wrestling with demons. "You think you're so clever," she hissed, voice cracking with hysteria. "Organizing resistance, filing complaints, bringing in federal agents to destroy legitimate community management." The smell of desperation mixed with her usual perfume created something nauseating. "Mrs. Ashworth, I know what you are," she screamed, stabbing her finger at my chest. "My private investigator found everything. Federal judge, right? Thought you could hide in suburbia and destroy me with your government connections." My blood went cold. Agent Martinez stepped into view behind me, hand instinctively moving toward her weapon. That's when the mini twist hit like a tactical nuclear strike. Brinley pulled out her phone, waving it like a weapon. "I've got photos of every federal agent who visited this house, license plates, faces, everything. My husband's congressional contacts are already investigating this abuse of federal power." And she'd been surveilling FBI agents conducting a federal investigation. That wasn't just obstruction, that was potential terrorism-related surveillance of law enforcement. Agent Martinez's professional demeanor evaporated instantly. "Ma'am, you're admitting to surveillance of federal agents during an active investigation?" "I'm protecting my community from government overreach," Brinley shrieked. "You people think you can destroy years of proper management because some deadbeat judge wants to avoid paying legitimate fines." The confession was beautiful in its completeness. Admission of surveillance, confirmation of knowing my identity, acknowledgement of the federal investigation, and threats against law enforcement, all recorded on FBI equipment. but she wasn't finished destroying herself. Those financial records you stole are protected HOA business. The insurance claims were completely legitimate. Every single violation was justified under community standards. Agent Martinez's pen moved across her notebook like she was transcribing a confession. Ma'am, are you referring to specific evidence currently under federal seal? I'm referring to my constitutional right to manage my community without federal interference. Then came the moment that would echo through her federal trial. Brinley grabbed my arm with surprising strength, her manicured nails digging into my skin. You want to know what happens to government agents who interfere with local business? My husband knows senators. We have congressional protection. You picked the wrong community to destroy. Physical assault on a federal judge during an FBI investigation while threatening law enforcement with political retaliation. Agent Martinez was practically taking dictation for the prosecution. Ma'am, please step back and keep your hands visible. Make me! That's when Chuck Brennan appeared from behind Brinley's Escalade with a baseball bat, looking like an angry suburban vigilante. Problem here, folks? He asked calmly. Heard screaming from 3 blocks away. Brinley spun around, eyes wild. You're part of this conspiracy. All of you organized against legitimate authority. Lady, the only thing we organized against was you stealing our houses. More neighbors emerged from shadows like suburban cavalry. Mrs. Brianna with her phone recording everything. Jessica with her teenage sons flanking her. Frank Wilson carrying something that looked suspiciously like pepper spray. Get away from me! Brinley screamed, backing toward her vehicle. I'll have you all arrested for harassment. Ma'am, Agent Martinez said with deadly calm, you're currently under federal surveillance. These residents are witnesses to your behavior. Brinley's face contorted with rage that had moved far beyond rational thought. Fine. Tomorrow's auction happens no matter what. I'll foreclose on every single one of you. She fled to her Escalade, tires smoking as she disappeared into the night like a suburban demon returning to hell. Agent Martinez closed her notebook with satisfaction. Assault on a federal judge, threats against law enforcement, surveillance of FBI agents, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy theories involving congressional corruption. Chuck lowered his bat. Think she's finally lost it completely? Completely, I confirmed, watching her taillights disappear. Tomorrow's auction was 12 hours away, but Brinley had just turned a financial crimes case into something approaching domestic terrorism. Federal prison was going to be very educational for her. Day 7. Auction day arrived with the electric tension of an approaching storm. I woke at 5 a.m. to the sound of vehicles assembling outside like a federal convoy. FBI surveillance units, state investigator cars, news vans, with satellite dishes reaching toward the dawn sky. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with morning coffee from Agent Martinez's command post in my garage. Target's been active all night, Martinez reported, studying surveillance photos on her tablet. She attempted to access Community Center at 2 a.m., tried to break into the HOA office at 3, and made 17 phone calls to numbers we're still tracing. Through my window, Willowbrook Estates looked like a neighborhood under siege. News crews setting up equipment, federal agents coordinating positions, neighbors gathering in small groups with the nervous energy of people about to witness history. But the morning's first shock came from an unexpected source. Chuck knocked on my door at 7 a.m. with news that made my judicial blood run cold. She's not alone, he said grimly. 3 black SUVs arrived at her house an hour ago. Men in suits who look like they know how to break things professionally. Agent Martinez immediately got on her radio. Command, we have unknown subjects at target residence, requesting background checks on all vehicles. The response crackled back within minutes. Private security firm, registered to shell company with ties to political consulting group. No criminal records, but several civil litigation histories. Brinley had hired muscle, professional intimidation specialists who operated in the gray area between legal pressure and outright threats. She's escalating to physical intimidation, Martinez observed. Desperate subjects often hire protection when they know arrest is imminent. But the mini twist came when Mrs. Brianna called with intelligence that changed everything. They're not just here for protection, she reported, voice shaking slightly. I saw them unloading equipment from those vehicles. Cameras, recording devices, something that looked like electronic surveillance gear. Brinley wasn't just planning to intimidate, she was planning to document and weaponize today's events. probably hoping to catch federal agents in compromising positions, record victim statements for later retaliation, or create propaganda about government overreach. My countermove required the precision of 15 years in federal courtrooms. Agent Martinez, what's your protocol for suspects who attempt to surveil ongoing federal operations? Additional obstruction charges, but we need to catch them in the act. Then let's give them something to record. I called an emergency neighborhood meeting for 10 a.m., 2 hours before the scheduled auction. Not to hide our activities, but to make them so public that any surveillance would become evidence of continued harassment. The community center filled with 73 neighbors, more than had ever gathered for any HOA meeting. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while victim after victim shared stories for the news cameras, creating a permanent record of Brinley's systematic abuse. Sure enough, Brinley's hired surveillance team positioned themselves around the building with professional-grade equipment, photographing faces, recording statements, documenting license plates. Perfect, Agent Martinez murmured, watching through binoculars. They're creating evidence of witness intimidation during an active federal investigation. But Brinley's final gambit was more desperate than anyone anticipated. At 11:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the auction, her Escalade pulled up flanked by those black SUVs like some kind of suburban presidential motorcade. She emerged wearing a business suit that probably cost more than most neighbors' monthly mortgage payments, flanked by her security detail and carrying a briefcase that looked expensive enough to buy a small car. The arrogance was breathtaking. Even facing federal investigation, she was staging a power play designed to intimidate the entire community into submission. But her performance was interrupted by something she clearly hadn't expected. A Channel 7 news reporter approached with cameras rolling, asking pointed questions about financial irregularities and elder abuse allegations. Instead of answering professionally, Brinley's mask slipped completely. This is a coordinated attack by disgruntled residents who refuse to follow community standards, she snarled into the camera. Federal agencies are being manipulated by troublemakers who want to destroy property values and community safety. She was attacking federal law enforcement on live television while under federal investigation. Agent Martinez nearly choked on her coffee watching the feed. She just accused the FBI of being manipulated by elderly residents on broadcast news, Martinez said in amazement. That's going to play beautifully in court. By noon, the community center was packed beyond capacity. Neighbors, media, federal agents, state investigators, and Brinley's intimidation squad all crammed into a space designed for municipal meetings, not federal justice. The air crackled with tension as 2 p.m. approached. Auction time. The moment Brinley expected to seize my house and demonstrate her continued power over the community. What she didn't realize was that in 30 minutes, her entire world would collapse in front of 73 neighbors, 5 news cameras, and enough federal agents to staff a small field office. I sat in the front row, looking at Elena's empty chair beside me, feeling her presence as strongly as if she were physically there. "Almost time, sweetheart," I whispered. "Justice is about to be served with the full attention it deserves." The final countdown had begun. 2:00 p.m. Showtime. The community center buzzed with electric tension as Brinley strode to the front podium like she was addressing a corporate board meeting instead of her victims. 73 neighbors filled every seat, news cameras positioned for optimal coverage, federal agents discreetly stationed around the room. The smell of nervous sweat mixed with anticipation as thick as morning fog. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brinley announced, her voice echoing off the walls with practiced authority, "we're here for the legally mandated auction of 1247 Maple Drive due to unpaid HOA violations and accumulated fines." She opened her briefcase with theatrical precision, spreading foreclosure documents across the podium like a dealer shuffling cards. Her security detail flanked the exits, trying to look intimidating while federal agents watched their every move. Opening bid is set at $847 to cover outstanding violations, interest, and legal fees. And the auctioneer, a nervous man who clearly hadn't expected this level of media attention, stepped forward with his microphone. But before he could speak, I stood up from my front row seat. "Point of order." My courtroom voice cut through the room like a blade. Brinley's confident smile flickered for just a moment. "Sir, this is a legal proceeding. Please remain seated." "Mrs. Ashworth, I believe there's something about my background you should understand before proceeding." Agent Martinez moved closer to the front, hand resting casually on her badge. The news cameras swiveled toward me like heat-seeking missiles. "I am the Honorable Thaddeus Blackstone, United States Federal Judge for the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the industrial carpet. Brinley's face transformed through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, pure terror. Furthermore, I continued, letting my judicial authority fill every corner of the room, you are currently under federal investigation for wire fraud, mail fraud, elder financial abuse, and racketeering under the RICO statute. The auctioneer backed away from the podium like it had caught fire. This is impossible, Brinley whispered, her voice barely audible. You're just a retired government worker. You can't be... Agent Martinez, I said calmly. I believe you have something for Mrs. Ashworth. Agent Martinez stepped forward, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and the entire room seemed to lean forward in collective anticipation. Brinley Ashworth, you're under arrest for violations of federal wire fraud statutes, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, and racketeering activities affecting interstate commerce. The handcuffs clicked shut around Brinley's wrists with the finality of a judge's gavel. But the mic drop moment came when she looked directly into the Channel 7 camera and made one last desperate play. This is a government conspiracy. I have congressional protection. My husband knows senators. Agent Martinez smiled the way federal agents smile when suspects hand them additional charges. Ma'am, those statements will be included in your obstruction of justice charges. The community center erupted in applause that started as scattered clapping and built into a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the walls. 73 neighbors who had been terrorized, intimidated, and financially abused, finally watching justice being served in the most public way possible. Mrs. Brianna was crying with relief. Chuck was pumping his fist like his team had won the World Series. Jessica was live streaming everything to social media where it would be viewed by millions within hours. But the most satisfying moment came when Agent Martinez announced the financial recovery. Ladies and gentlemen, federal asset forfeiture has frozen all HOA accounts and recovered $127,000 in embezzled community funds. These resources will be returned to affected homeowners and used to reform HOA governance under federal oversight. Frank Wilson, who had lost his house to Brinley's manufactured assessments, broke down completely. I can get my home back, he sobbed. After 3 years, I can finally go home. As federal marshals led Brinley toward the exit in handcuffs, she made eye contact with me one final time. You destroyed my life, she hissed. No, Mrs. Ashworth, I replied with the calm authority of 15 years on the federal bench. You destroyed your own life the moment you decided to prey on vulnerable neighbors. I simply ensured there were consequences. The news cameras captured every moment as she was loaded into a federal vehicle, her white Escalade being hooked to a tow truck as evidence, her hired security team slinking away like shadows at dawn. The auction was officially canceled. My house was safe. 43 families would receive financial restitution, and every HOA tyrant in America would think twice before targeting elderly residents after watching this footage go viral. As the crowd slowly dispersed, neighbors hugging each other and planning celebration dinners, I felt Elena's presence stronger than ever. Justice served, sweetheart, I whispered to the empty chair beside me, just like you always believed it should be. Outside, the sound of news helicopters mixed with the laughter of children finally able to ride their bicycles without fear of violation notices. Willowbrook Estates was free. 1 month later. The morning coffee tasted like freedom. I sat on my back porch watching cardinals flit around Elena's bird feeder, the same feeder that started this entire battle. The autumn air smelled like fresh possibilities instead of fear and litigation. The transformation of Willowbrook Estates had been remarkable to witness. Brinley Ashworth was currently residing in federal detention awaiting trial, facing a potential 15-year sentence that would ensure she never terrorized another neighborhood. Her assets had been seized, her shell companies dissolved, her family's contracting business shut down pending investigation. But the real victory wasn't her punishment. It was watching a community heal. The $127,000 in recovered funds had been returned to victimized families with interest. Frank Wilson was back in his house, tending a garden that Mrs. Brianna had helped him replant. The Henderson family had their property restored to original condition at HOA expense. Jessica's kids rode their bicycles freely without fear of manufactured violations. Chuck knocked on my back door with his usual morning greeting and a steaming cup of coffee. "Morning, Your Honor," he said with a grin that had become routine. The neighborhood had collectively decided that my judicial title wasn't going back into hiding. Any word on the federal legislation? Jessica says the Homeowner Protection Act passed committee yesterday, should reach full Senate vote next month. The ripple effects had exceeded every expectation. Frank's daughter's news story had sparked nationwide investigations into HOA abuse patterns. Congressional hearings were exposing systematic elder targeting across multiple states. Federal prosecutors were building cases against similar operations from coast to coast. But the most satisfying change was local and personal. We'd established the Willowbrook Community Fund using recovered assets, providing scholarships for residents' children and emergency assistance for elderly neighbors. Mrs. Brianna managed it with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting years to channel her organizational skills toward helping instead of surviving. The annual Democracy Day Festival was scheduled for next weekend, a community celebration of civic engagement and accountability. Local news would cover it as a model for neighborhoods nationwide. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. Guilty plea hearing scheduled for Friday. She's accepting 20-year federal sentence in exchange for cooperation against similar operations in 3 other states. Justice moving forward with the inexorable momentum of federal law. Elena's voice seemed to whisper through the morning breeze. Sometimes the smallest battles create the biggest victories. She'd been right, as always. What started as harassment over a bird feeder had become a federal case study in protecting vulnerable communities from predatory abuse. The doorbell rang, interrupting my morning reflection. Mrs. Brianna stood on my front step with a manila envelope and the smile of someone delivering good news. Official documents for your signature, Mr. Federal Judge. The community wants you as permanent HOA board president. Unanimous vote. I laughed, the first genuine laughter I'd felt since Elena died. Mrs. Brianna, after 15 years of federal cases, I'm not sure I'm ready for HOA politics. Perfect qualification. You've seen real corruption, so you'll spot the fake stuff immediately. She had a point. After prosecuting organized crime and terrorism cases, managing community pool maintenance and landscaping standards would feel like vacation. Besides, she continued, someone needs to ensure this never happens again. Who better than someone who knows exactly how to build federal cases against suburban tyrants? The wisdom in her words was undeniable. Communities needed protectors who understood both local needs and legal consequences of abuse. All right, Mrs. Brianna, but I want Jessica as vice president and Chuck as treasurer. This board represents the neighbors who fought back, not just another authority structure. Already arranged. Frank's handling communications, Maria's managing maintenance, and I'm keeping the financial records transparent enough for federal auditing. Perfect. A neighborhood run by people who'd experienced systematic abuse would never tolerate its return. As Mrs. Brianna headed home, I looked back at Elena's bird feeder where cardinals continued their eternal dance between the branches. Well, sweetheart, I said to the morning air, retirement's been more interesting than expected, but I think you'd approve of the results. The sound of children's laughter echoed through Willowbrook Estates, the truest measure of a community's health.